June 4, 1943, Camp Hearne, Texas. The projection lamp buzzed softly in the darkened recreation hall, its beam cutting through the haze of cigarette smoke. 200 German officers sat motionless, their faces dimly lit by the flicker of a Hollywood film. The air carried the faint hum of the generator outside, the rustle of khaki uniforms, the distant echo of a military bugle fading into the humid night. At the back of the room, Oberleutnant Hermann Fischer gripped a fountain pen, its nib trembling above the pages of his hidden journal. He was writing words that, had they been found by his own SS superiors in Africa, would have meant a firing squad. The Americans, he wrote, are showing us their films, not propaganda but cinema. True cinema. Tonight we saw Gone with the Wind. It cannot be real. No nation at war possesses such beauty, such art, such abundance. The film's orchestra swelled through the hall, echoing off wooden walls built by prisoners' own hands. On screen, Vivian Leigh and Clark Gable moved through burning cities and broken hearts. A story of defeat and renewal that mirrored the world these men had left behind. For years they had been told that America was a mongrel nation, crude and cultureless, incapable of producing greatness. Yet here, in a prisoner of war camp surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, they were witnessing an epic so vast, so technically perfect, that it seemed to belong to another civilization entirely. Just one day earlier, these men had arrived from North Africa, the proud remnants of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, men who had marched across deserts and commanded respect even from their enemies. The small town of Hearne had turned out to watch their arrival, unaware that the true battle for these soldiers was only beginning, a quiet war of images and ideas. As the projector whirred and the screen glowed, something shifted in the stillness of that Texas night. The film ended, but no one moved. Fischer would later write, "I saw faces changed in that darkness. Eyes widened not by defeat but by revelation. We had come to America expecting humiliation. Instead, we found something far more dangerous, admiration. The capitulation of the body had happened in Tunisia. What began in Texas was the capitulation of the mind, May 1943. The Atlantic Ocean rolled beneath the Liberty ships carrying the defeated soldiers of the Afrika Korps to captivity. Their uniforms were still sun-bleached from the deserts of Tunisia, their insignias dulled by sand and exhaustion. Above deck, guards smoked in silence, while below, in the dim cargo holds converted to barracks, the hum of the ship's engine was broken by something unexpected: laughter. It came from a makeshift screen hung between steel beams, where a flickering image danced across the shadows. A film was playing, Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. For many of the German prisoners, it was their first time seeing Chaplin. His films had been banned in the Reich since 1933. To them, he was a forbidden name, a Jewish actor mocking the Führer himself. The moment Chaplin appeared, that unmistakable mustache, the exaggerated salute, the absurd pomp, a strange tension filled the air. Some prisoners looked away, offended. Others stared, entranced, uncertain whether to be angry or amazed. Feldwebel Otto Kraus, captured with the 15th Panzer Division, later recalled, "We were crossing the ocean as prisoners, yet that film mocked everything we had been told was sacred. It was the first crack in the wall. By the time the convoy reached the Gulf of Mexico, the prisoners had seen more American films, short comedies, westerns, and training reels projected in the ship's mess halls. Each one chipped away at the image of a decadent enemy they had carried for years. The equipment itself became an object of fascination. The projectors ran quietly, their sound synchronization perfect, their lenses producing crisp images even in the ship's constant vibration. To men who prided themselves on German engineering, it was unsettling. When the ships finally docked, 1,850 men stepped into the blinding Texas sun at Camp Hearne. The first thing they noticed wasn't the guards or the fences, but the cleanliness, the order, the scale of the camp. Wooden barracks, medical stations, libraries, workshops, and most curious of all, a recreation hall large enough for several hundred men, its stage built for plays and films. It was not what they had imagined captivity to be. As dusk fell on their first evening, an American officer entered the barracks and announced the schedule: meals, roll call, and on Saturday, movie night. It was a phrase that seemed absurd to men raised under the eye of Joseph Goebbels. But by the week's end, they would understand that this was not kindness. It was something more deliberate, something powerful. A new kind of warfare, waged not with guns but with dreams. August 15, 1943. Camp Clinton, Mississippi. The heat clung to the pine trees like a curtain, thick and breathless, as the German prisoners filed quietly into the new theater they had built themselves. Rows of wooden benches filled the hall, the smell of fresh lumber mixing with tobacco and dust. At the back stood General Gustav von Verst, one of the highest-ranking German officers in captivity, a man accustomed to marble halls and military precision. He watched as his fellow officers, once commanders of armored divisions, now took their seats in a hall lit only by the faint orange glow of the projector. The film that night was Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The lights dimmed, and Frank Capra's vision of American democracy came to life on the makeshift screen. What followed was beyond comprehension. The prisoners watched an American senator denounce corruption in his own government, watched a naive man fight his own political system, watched newspapers criticize elected official, and realized that this was not propaganda, but truth presented without fear. In Nazi Germany, such a film would have meant death for everyone involved. Here it was entertainment. Von Verst later recalled, it was inconceivable. An enemy nation showing weakness, self-criticism, imperfection, and taking pride in it. I began to suspect that this, not military strength, was their true power. The room remained silent as the film ended. No orders were given, no discussions permitted, yet a quiet unease spread among the men. It was not defeat that troubled them, but realization that the Reich's carefully constructed image of America was crumbling in front of them. The projection equipment itself drew fascination. German engineers studied the Bell & Howell 16mm machines with reverence. They ran with a precision that rivaled Zeiss optics, with reels that never slipped, lenses that never overheated. To soldiers raised on the myth of German mechanical superiority, even the projectors were a revelation. Unteroffizier Friedrich Becker, an engineer from Jena, wrote in his journal, "The perfection of their machines mirrors their culture, smooth, silent, efficient." Perhaps we have been wrong about who leads in craftsmanship. Outside, the Mississippi crickets chirped as the men returned to their barracks, but inside their minds something was shifting. Not in rage, not in despair, but in quiet astonishment. A democracy that exposed its flaws, that allowed dissent and yet thrived. This was not the weakness they had been taught to despise. It was resilience. It was strength disguised as humility. And for the first time, the prisoners wondered if the war they fought had never been for truth at all. September 1943. Camp Hearne, Texas. The cicadas had fallen silent that evening. A strange, heavy stillness hung over the pine barrens. Inside the recreation hall, the prisoners sat in perfect rows, their uniforms faded and patched, their boots dusty from work detail. The projector hummed softly, and the title flickered onto the whitewashed wall. Mrs. Miniver. It was a British film, that much they knew from the announcement. Some scoffed quietly, others leaned forward curious. The story began simply enough. A middle-class English family, a quiet village life, the clouds of war gathering over their rooftops. But as the film unfolded, something unprecedented happened among the German prisoners. On screen, German bombers screamed over London. The Miniver family huddled in their garden shelter as the earth trembled with explosions. The sound, the same sound these men had once commanded, now echoed through the camp hall. Each blast struck differently here. The children crying in the film were not enemies. They were only human. One officer, Oberleutnant Karl Henke, stared motionless at the flickering wall. 2 years earlier, he had flown over Coventry as a navigator. He had seen the fires below, the destruction he now watched reenacted from the other side. His hands trembled as Greer Garson's character read from her diary. "We are all of us refugees, each in his own way." In the half-light of the projection beam, a tear traced the dust on his cheek. The guards, standing at the doors, noticed the silence that followed the final scene. No applause, no whispers, just the rustle of uniforms as men stood and walked out into the night one by one. Some looked up at the Texas stars, others simply sat on the steps outside the hall, heads lowered. In his secret diary, Fisher wrote that night, "I do not know how to describe what happened. We felt something breaking. Not our loyalty, but our certainty." The enemy had faces, mothers, and courage. The film was not a weapon. It was a mirror. The following morning, the camp's commandant, Colonel Louis H. Minturn, received a note from one of the German officers. A single sentence written in neat cursive. "You have defeated us more completely with this film than with all your bombs." It was the beginning of a quiet transformation, one that neither side had planned. October 1943. The morning sun rose over Camp Hearne, washing the rows of wooden barracks in pale gold. American guards made their usual rounds, but there was something subtly different in the air. A quiet, measured discipline among the prisoners. They worked efficiently, spoke politely, and no longer carried the defiance that had marked their arrival months before. The transformation hadn't come from lectures, punishments, or interrogations. It had come from the flicker of film. Captain Henry Kellogg, the camp's morale officer, began noticing it first. During inspections, he saw German officers discussing scenes from American movies. Casablanca, Yankee Doodle Dandy Mrs. Miniver. They debated dialogue, dissected storylines, quoted lines from Humphrey Bogart as if from Goethe. The library requests changed too. Fewer books on strategy and engineering, more on American history, architecture, and literature. Even the camp theater, once a venue for German plays and marching songs, now staged performances inspired by what they'd seen on screen. The Army's Psychological Warfare Division took notice. Reports from Camp Hearne, Camp Clinton, and Camp McCain were quietly circulated through Washington. One memo, marked confidential, for internal use only, summarized the findings. Exposure to American media appears to erode hostility and foster admiration. The enemy officers display a growing curiosity toward democratic values and individual freedom. Suggest continuation. In reality, what began as routine morale programming for prisoners had become an unintentional psychological experiment, and a successful one. No coercion, no forced indoctrination, just films. Inside the camp, General von Verst maintained a strict outward discipline, but even he had begun to change. During a walk with Captain Kellogg one afternoon, he confessed quietly, "Your films, they show your people as imperfect yet proud of it. We were taught to fear such weakness. Now I see it may be strength." American officers said nothing publicly. They simply expanded the screenings. Films were rotated weekly, from Capra's idealism to Chaplin's satire, from Stagecoach to Citizen Kane. A silent agreement grew among the guards. These reels of celluloid were doing more for peace than any speech could. By winter, the effects were measurable. The number of disciplinary incidents dropped by half. The prisoners painted murals of American landscapes on the walls of their recreation halls. And in the camp's unofficial newspaper, a handwritten editorial appeared, unsigned, but unmistakably German. Perhaps the true victory in war is not to conquer land, but to understand the conqueror. December 1943. A cold front swept across Texas, coating the camp fences in silver frost. The prisoners pulled their wool coats tighter as they lined up for roll call, unaware that new faces were watching them from the edge of the parade ground. Men in civilian coats, clipboards in hand, and quiet eyes that observed more than they spoke. They weren't part of the camp staff. They were from Washington. The group belonged to the Office of War Information, a small branch of the U.S. government responsible for managing psychological operations and wartime propaganda. Officially, they were visiting to inspect camp morale. Unofficially, they were there to study something far more curious. The emotional shift occurring inside the minds of German officers held thousands of miles from the front. Their lead observer, Dr. Harold Lassiter, was a professor of social psychology before the war. One of those men who believed that ideology could be measured, like blood pressure. For days, he interviewed prisoners under the guise of cultural research. He asked them what they thought of America, what surprised them most, and which films they had seen. What he recorded in his notes astonished even him. Repeated exposure to American cinema produces not resentment, but admiration, he wrote. Hostile beliefs are eroded not through confrontation, but through empathy. The films communicate abundance, humor, and moral complexity, qualities absent in totalitarian life. The result is cognitive dissonance strong enough to fracture prior loyalties. In the evenings, Lassiter and his assistants sat at the back of the recreation hall, noting audience reactions, who laughed, who wept, who looked away during scenes of ordinary American life. The laughter during It Happened One Night was genuine. The silence during The Grapes of Wrath was reverent. Even the most stoic officers, men decorated for bravery in the desert, stared at the screen with the quiet hunger of men seeing freedom for the first time. In one of his confidential reports, Lassiter used a phrase that would later echo through post-war studies. The moving image has succeeded where interrogation has failed. By the time his team left Hearne, their recommendation was clear: continue the screenings, document the results, and expand the program to other camps. What had begun as entertainment was now recognized as a subtle instrument of re-education, not through propaganda, but through truth shown without disguise. That winter, the War Department quietly approved additional funding for camp theaters across America. The reels kept turning, and behind the barbed wire, a silent revolution of the mind continued. Frame by frame, scene by scene, January 1944. Washington, D.C., the snow outside the War Department fell in thin, slanted sheets, melting as it touched the black cars lined along Constitution Avenue. Inside room 3B213, a closed-door meeting had begun. 3 men from the Office of War Information, 2 from the War Department, and a single representative from the newly formed Office of Strategic Services in the OSS sat around a walnut table, reviewing Dr. Lassiter's report from Camp Hearne. The room smelled faintly of ink and cigarette smoke. Pages rustled. A phrase repeated itself across the memo spread out before them. The moving image has succeeded where interrogation has failed. Colonel Arthur Hale, a pragmatic man who had seen combat in North Africa, was skeptical. "We're not in the business of converting prisoners," he said. "We're here to win a war." But the OSS observer, a thin man in a dark suit named Walter Lippmann, saw something else. He tapped the paper lightly and said, "You don't see it yet, Colonel. What's happening in those camps may decide how Germany thinks after we've won." For the next hour, they debated the ethics and potential of what Lassiter's findings suggested. That exposure to American cinema, honest, imperfect, humane, was creating a psychological shift more durable than any forced confession. One memo summarized the essence of their discussion. The German officers, trained to view democracy as chaos, have encountered in film an image of order through freedom. This is ideological disarmament. The proposal that emerged was cautious but visionary. The War Department would quietly expand the screenings, but not as propaganda. The goal would be familiarization, to show the prisoners the everyday life of the people they fought against. A farmer in Iowa, a teacher in Ohio, a mother in Kansas sending letters to her son overseas. These were not to be war films, but windows into normalcy, the most subversive message of all. Lippmann later wrote in a private memorandum to the OSS director, "A nation that can humanize its enemy will control the peace that follows. The cinema has given us the means to do so without a single bullet." By spring, new reels were shipped to every major POW camp. Our Town, The Human Comedy, The More the Merrier. None of these films mentioned the war. None of them needed to. Their power lay in their ordinariness. While Europe burned behind the fences of Texas and Mississippi, a quiet experiment in post-war democracy had already begun. And though no one outside those walls yet knew it, America was not only defeating Germany on the battlefield, it was beginning to win inside the German soul. March 1944. Camp Hearne. The first wildflowers began to appear along the Texas fence lines, small bursts of color against the rusted wire. Inside the camp, a quiet metamorphosis was taking place. One not ordered, not planned, but born from within. The German prisoners had begun publishing their own newspaper. Written by hand, mimeographed in the camp print shop and circulated from barrack to barrack, it was called Der Ruf, The Call. Officially, it was meant to boost morale and share news. Unofficially, it had become something far more profound. In its first issue, a poem appeared on the front page. "We came as soldiers, proud and blind, but walls can fall inside the mind. Beyond the wire, a different fight, to see with eyes restored to light." The editors, all former officers, began including essays on American culture, reflections on democracy, and film reviews of the weekly screenings. One issue featured a long discussion of our town, marveling at its simplicity. The American strength, it read, is not in conquest but in contentment. The ordinary man here is king of his small world, and no one dares tell him otherwise. Soon after, Camp Hearne's theater troupe began rehearsing a play of their own, Heimat in der Fremde, Home in a Foreign Land. The story followed a captured German soldier who gradually comes to see his enemies as human beings. It was not propaganda, it was confession. When the play opened, the entire camp attended. The guards stood at the back, unsure what to expect. The performance was raw, emotional, filled with moments of silence so heavy they felt sacred. When the curtain fell, a simple bedsheet strung on rope, no one clapped for a full 10 seconds. Then applause erupted. Captain Kellogg, watching from the doorway, wrote in his report that night, "We did not teach them this. They learned it themselves." Even General von Verst attended a later performance. Afterward, he approached the young lieutenant who had written the script and said quietly, "If Germany had more men like you and fewer like me, perhaps the world would look different." By now, the change in the camp was unmistakable. The newspaper spread to other camps across the South. Officers began teaching English classes, translating American novels, and writing their own reflections. On democracy and moral responsibility, the U.S. Guards began to joke that their prisoners were becoming more American than the Americans, but behind the humor was a recognition of something deeper. The transformation was now self-sustaining. The seeds planted by flickering films had taken root, and what grew behind the barbed wire was not defeat, but understanding. May 1944. The Texas heat returned, heavy and shimmering, pressing down on the tin roofs of the barracks. By now, the war in Europe had turned decisively against Germany. Word of Allied landings in Italy spread through the camp, carried by newspapers and whispered rumors. Yet what unsettled German command far more than the battles abroad were the letters arriving from America. Letters written by their captured officers, each one carefully censored, yet still radiating something that no ink could hide. Every week, hundreds of envelopes left Camp Hearne, Camp Clinton, Camp McCain, addressed to wives, parents, and sweethearts across the Reich. The prisoners were instructed to write home in German, but every line was read by American intelligence, translated and quietly copied before mailing. Over time, a pattern emerged. One officer wrote, "We are treated with a dignity I cannot explain. The Americans feed us the same as their own soldiers. They let us read their books, see their films, even debate their government aloud. Imagine such a thing, my dear Liesel. People laughing at their leaders and not being shot for it." Another wrote home after watching Casablanca, "There is a line in the film, 'We'll always have Paris.' It is about love and loss. But here it feels like something more. They know what they fight for, and it is not for conquest. It is for the right to feel human." American censors noticed the tone. There was no hatred, no bitterness. Instead, there was confusion, followed by admiration. The Office of War Information gathered dozens of such letters, marking them psychological value high. In one report, an analyst noted, "If these letters are reaching Germany unaltered, they may be more effective than any leaflet we could drop." But the Gestapo noticed too. By summer, the Reich Postal Ministry began intercepting and blacklisting correspondence from U.S. camps. Several families of POWs were interrogated. Some never received another letter. Yet enough made it through, and enough whispers spread through German towns, that the myth of barbaric American prison camps began to crumble. In one intercepted letter, found after the war in Berlin, a lieutenant from Hearne had written, "Do not believe what they tell you of our captors. They are not savages. Their strength lies not in cruelty but in mercy, and that, I fear, is what will destroy us." Inside Camp Hearne, few prisoners knew their words had become a weapon, but Washington did. Intelligence officers began referring to the correspondence as the letters front, a front with no trenches, no bombs, no casualties, yet capable of reshaping everything the enemy believed. And somewhere, deep in the War Department archives, a memo was filed under a single heading that would never appear in public record: Re-Education by Humanity, July 1944. A train from Washington rolled into the small Texas station near Camp Hearne under the cover of night. From it stepped a group of men in tailored suits, their accents clipped and deliberate. British intelligence officers sent by the Ministry of Information. They had come not to interrogate, but to observe. What was happening inside these American camps had reached London through quiet diplomatic cables. German officers exhibiting ideological shift after exposure to U.S. culture. Recommend joint evaluation. The visitors were escorted past the fences at dawn. The camp stretched before them, neat, orderly, almost serene. They expected bitterness, hostility, perhaps fear. What they found instead was something close to a small university. In one corner, prisoners were painting. In another, a group sat outside reading Shakespeare in English, their notebooks filled with translations and phonetic markings. The British officers paused at the theater, where the Germans were rehearsing a scene from our town. The dialogue about small-town life in America was being recited with accents still heavy but sincere. The irony was not lost on anyone. Captured officers of the Wehrmacht performing American plays with genuine emotion. Colonel Geoffrey Morland, one of the British observers, leaned toward Captain Kellogg and whispered, "You're not running a prison camp, old boy. You're running a social experiment." Kellogg simply smiled. "We didn't plan it that way," he said. "The films did the work." Later that afternoon, the delegation met with Dr. Lassiter in a small office near the mess hall. Stacks of reports filled his desk, each detailing behavioral changes among the prisoners. Reductions in aggression, increases in cooperation, spontaneous acts of empathy. Lassiter showed them excerpts from letters and camp newspapers emphasizing one line: "They no longer speak of the Reich, they speak of Germany." It was a subtle but seismic shift. The Nazi ideal was dissolving into something older, more human, and perhaps more enduring. A sense of belonging not to ideology, but to homeland. By evening, the British officers gathered in the camp's makeshift screening room. The film that night was the human comedy. They watched alongside hundreds of German POWs, the room filled with quiet breathing and the soft crackle of the projector. When the final scene ended, the boy reading his brother's letter about faith and endurance, even the British delegation sat in silence. After the lights came up, Colonel Morland wrote a single note in his pocket diary. "This, not retribution, will rebuild Europe." When the delegation returned to London, their report reached the Ministry of Information and eventually the War Cabinet. The memo's title was understated: "Observations on the Moral Rehabilitation of Enemy Personnel." But its final line carried a quiet prophecy. The future peace will not be secured by force of arms, but by mastery of the image, the weapon that conquers without killing. August 1944. The Texas evenings grew long and amber, the air filled with the scent of mesquite and the low hum of crickets. In Camp Hearne, the guards noticed something astonishing. The German officers, once rigid in their rank and ritual, now gathered in circles outside their barracks long after roll call, not to sing marching songs or recite orders, but to talk. The conversations were quiet at first, hesitant, conducted in a mixture of German and broken English. But as weeks passed, the circles grew larger and the words bolder. They called themselves Diskussionskreis, discussion group. What they discussed would have been treason in the Reich. Inside Barrack 12, on a humid evening, a dozen men sat around a wooden table lit by a single bulb. Among them was Oberleutnant Hermann Fischer, once Rommel's signal officer, now an unofficial teacher. He read slowly from a translation of the Federalist Papers, stopping to explain words like liberty or consent and republic. Across from him sat Hauptmann Heinrich Bremer, a stern career soldier who had once lectured others on the purity of the German race. Now he listened in silence. Fischer closed the book and said quietly, "Do you understand what this means? Power drawn from the people, not given by the state, not decreed by a leader. We have never had this." Bremer hesitated. "It sounds chaotic." "Yes," Fischer said, "and yet it works. That is the mystery." Around the camp, similar gatherings appeared. Men reading American newspapers, comparing constitutions, translating speeches by Roosevelt. The camp library's English section grew so popular that guards began lending their own books. One prisoner even started teaching an English grammar course. Another drew diagrams explaining how U.S. elections functioned. What astonished the American officers most was not what the prisoners learned, but how they applied it. A group of junior officers petitioned the camp commandant for a prisoners' council, a democratic committee to resolve disputes, distribute supplies, and represent grievances. To everyone's surprise, Colonel Minturn approved it. Within weeks, elections were held. Ballots were cast secretly, counted publicly. The process was simple, fair, and dignified, and the impact profound. One American sergeant watching the proceedings murmured, "They're practicing democracy before they even have a country to return to." Yet not everyone welcomed this transformation. A handful of die-hard Nazis, men who still wore their swastika rings and whispered of Hitler's inevitable victory, saw these discussions as betrayal. One night, propaganda leaflets appeared on the barracks doors, accusing fellow prisoners of becoming Amerikan versucht, infected by America. The camp's invisible war had begun, not between nations, but between two visions of Germany's soul. September 1944. The calm at Camp Hearne began to fracture. The once predictable rhythm of daily life, roll call, meals, work detail, films, was interrupted by something darker, unseen but deeply felt. The ideological fault lines that had split Germany were now running through Texas soil. Barrack 14 became the heart of resistance. Inside, a group of hardened SS men, veterans of the Afrika Korps and the Eastern Front, gathered around a crudely drawn Reich flag pinned to the wall. They called themselves the Schwarze Kameradschaft, the Black Brotherhood. They spoke of betrayal, of weak officers corrupted by American comfort, of a war not yet lost but betrayed from within. To them, the growing talk of democracy among fellow prisoners was not curiosity, it was treason. Each night, as films played in the recreation hall, Casablanca, Yankee Doodle Dandy, Mrs. Miniver, these men sat apart, muttering that Hollywood was poison disguised as art. "They laugh while we rot," one of them growled. "And our brothers applaud the laughter of our enemies." By October, intimidation began. Men who spoke too freely about American values found their bunks vandalized, their food stolen, their letters home destroyed. One morning, a crude message appeared scrawled in coal on the barrack wall. "A German who admires America is no German at all." On the night of October 27th, the conflict turned violent. Hauptmann Bremer, the same officer who had once listened silently to Hermann Fischer's readings, was attacked near the camp fence. He had been returning from the chapel after organizing a discussion on post-war reconstruction. 3 men ambushed him with improvised clubs. Guards found him unconscious, his jaw broken, the word Verräter, traitor, carved into the dirt beside his body. The next morning, Camp Hearne awoke divided. Nearly 200 prisoners refused to work, demanding punishment for the attackers. Others, led by SS men, staged a counter-protest, shouting that Bremer had sided with the enemy. The camp commandant, Colonel Minturn, faced an unprecedented crisis, a political civil war inside a POW compound. That night, American MPs entered Barrack 14. They found Nazi insignia hidden under mattresses, notebooks filled with coded propaganda, even sketches of Hitler torn from old newspapers. 30 prisoners were transferred to Camp Alva, Oklahoma, the Nazi camp, reserved for the most unrepentant. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. The men who had once feared their captors now feared one another. And yet, amid that tension, something irreversible had happened. The power of the Nazi minority was broken. A week later, the projector in the recreation hall flickered to life once more. The film that played was Why We Fight: The Battle of Russia. Hundreds of German prisoners sat watching their own war reframed. The frozen plains of the Eastern Front, the shattered cities, the endless graves. When the lights came on, no one spoke. Hermann Fischer looked around the silent room and whispered, "We are no longer prisoners of America. We are prisoners of the truth." November 1944. The air in Camp Hearne had changed, colder, quieter, and charged with a kind of wary reflection. After the violence, Colonel Minturn made a decision that few in the army supported, but which he believed necessary. The prisoners would no longer be shielded from the realities of the war they had fought. On a gray afternoon, guards assembled hundreds of men in the camp's recreation hall. The projector had been cleaned, the screen patched, the chairs lined in military rows. But this was no movie night. The title that flashed on the wall read simply, Nazi concentration camps, evidence for Nuremberg. The film began with the gates of Buchenwald. At first, the prisoners watched in confusion. The camera panned over heaps of clothing, mountains of shoes, barbed wire fences. Some whispered that the footage was staged, American propaganda. But then came the faces. The camera did not flinch, hollow eyes, skeletal limbs, bodies stacked like firewood. German signs, German guards, German insignia. A murmur spread through the hall. One man stood up and shouted, "Lies! Lies!" Another demanded the film be stopped. But Minturn gave no order. The projector rattled on, filling the dark room with light and unbearable silence. When it ended, no one moved. For several minutes, the only sound was the reel spinning down. Then from the back of the hall, a voice broke the silence. It was Oberleutnant Fischer. His words were barely audible. "If this is true," he said, "then we have built a house of honor upon a foundation of corpses." That night, camp guards reported something they had never seen before. Groups of German prisoners burning their own letters and photographs bearing Nazi symbols. The next morning, the camp's flagpole, where prisoners were allowed to hang a small German banner, stood bare. American officers took note. Reports from Camp Hearne to Washington described a psychological transformation. One memo read, "For the first time, German prisoners questioned not whether they lost the war, but whether they deserved to win it." In the barracks, debates turned from politics to morality. How had they not known? Was ignorance guilt? Could loyalty be criminal? Some men, especially the younger ones, withdrew entirely, staring for hours through the fence at the Texas horizon. Others found new purpose, translating books about democracy, volunteering to help farm families, or writing essays on rebuilding Germany. But not all accepted what they saw. A few clung harder to denial, insisting the footage was forged, the victims Polish, Russian, anyone but Jews. They called Fischer a traitor and Bremer a fool. Yet even their voices grew faint, drowned out by the simple, devastating evidence of film and memory. The prisoners who once arrived believing themselves soldiers of destiny now understood they had been witnesses and accomplices to something monstrous. And in that understanding, Camp Hearne ceased to be just a prison. It became a classroom and a confessional. December 1944. The first frost came to Texas, thin and glittering across the fences of Camp Hearne. The war in Europe raged on, Ardennes, Bastogne, the Rhine, but within the camp, a quieter war unfolded, one between the Germany that was and the Germany that might yet be reborn. It began with letters. After the screenings, Colonel Minturn granted permission for the prisoners to write home. Unrestricted letters, as long as they contained no military secrets. What the Germans wrote stunned even the censors. The letters no longer carried boasts of honor or sacrifice. They carried confession. "Father," one corporal wrote, "we have been lied to. Everything we believed about the Reich was built on ashes. The Americans showed us film, real film, of what our leaders have done. I cannot describe it. I feel as if the ground under our name has vanished." Another wrote to his wife, "Do not let the children salute anyone again. Tell them that obedience without conscience is death." Dozens of such letters poured through the mail office each week. The American clerks, whose job it was to censor outgoing mail, began quietly saving copies. One lieutenant later described it as the first whispers of Germany's repentance. The camp chaplain, a soft-spoken Methodist from Kansas named Reverend Cole, organized evening gatherings for discussion. He called them fellowship circles, but they became something deeper, places where men wept openly for the first time. Some prayed, others simply sat in silence, staring at their hands as if seeing them for the first time. One night, Oberleutnant Fischer stood and read from a new letter he had written, not to his family, but to the future. "We must return home not as soldiers, but as witnesses. We have seen what blind obedience makes of men. Our children must never see that again. If there is to be a Germany, it must be one that builds, not burns." When he finished, there was no applause, only the quiet sound of men breathing, the sound of walls inside them beginning to fall. Even the guards noticed the change. Prisoners began helping with camp chores, volunteering in local harvests, even teaching German to curious American children who came with their parents. One Texan farmer, after working beside a former Luftwaffe pilot, wrote in his journal, "He works like a man trying to earn back his own name." By Christmas, the mess hall was decorated with handmade stars cut from paper, not swastikas. The choir sang Stille Nacht and Silent Night together, in German and English, their voices blending in the cold air. That night, an American sentry on watch near the fence overheard two prisoners speaking softly in the dark. "Do you think we can ever go home again?" one asked. The other paused, then said, "Only if we never forget what we saw here." April 1945. The news came over the camp's loudspeakers like thunder in a quiet field. Berlin surrounded. Hitler missing. Germany collapsing. For a moment, the men of Camp Hearne didn't move. The guards, usually brisk with orders, stood still, hats in hand. Then slowly, from one barrack to the next, the sound spread. Murmurs, disbelief, and finally silence. The Reich that had once promised 1,000 years had lasted 12. A week later, on May 8th, the camp radio broadcast the words no one thought they'd hear. "Germany has unconditionally surrendered. Vide." In towns across America, church bells rang and flags unfurled. But inside the barbed wire, there was no celebration. The German prisoners sat in small groups, faces pale, hands folded. Some wept quietly. Others stared at the ground, whispering prayers that sounded like apologies. Oberleutnant Hermann Fischer called a meeting that evening in the chapel. The benches were filled, Luftwaffe, infantry, sailors, even the once proud officers who had mocked him months earlier. He spoke slowly, his voice steady. "We are no longer soldiers of a nation. We are survivors of a lie. We came here wearing uniforms. We will leave wearing guilt. But guilt, if carried with honesty, can become purpose." He paused, looking at the men before him. Some barely 20, others gray and hollow-eyed. "When we return home, they will call us defeated. Let them. But we have seen something here that Germany must see too. What freedom looks like when it is not forced. What dignity means when it is shared. This camp, this fence, it showed us the difference between captivity and conscience. For weeks, the camp waited for transport orders. Rumors spread that some prisoners would be sent to Britain first, others to France for labor duty, and some directly back to the ruins of their homeland. Meanwhile, the guards began dismantling what had become, in every sense, a small and strange civilization. The projector was boxed up. The library cataloged and shipped out. The vegetable gardens, once tended by prisoners, began to wither in the Texas heat. Many Americans struggled to say goodbye. Sergeant Donnelly, who had patrolled the same fence for 3 years, shook hands with Fisher on the final roll call. "You were a damn fine prisoner, Lieutenant," he said with a wry smile. Fisher nodded. "And you were a decent jailer, Sergeant." When the buses came, there was no music, no flags, only a quiet exchange of looks. Men leaving behind a country that had shown them its strength not through victory, but mercy. As the convoy pulled away, Reverend Cole stood by the gate with his hat over his heart. "Go in peace," he whispered, though few could hear him. "And may you never return to the darkness you came from." For many of those men, they never did. Autumn 1946. Germany was no longer a country, it was a scar. Cities lay in ruins. Bridges collapsed into gray rivers, children played in the shells of bombed buildings. Across this wasteland, trains rolled in slowly from the west, carrying the men who had once been enemies, now returning as ghosts of a lost world. Among them was Oberleutnant Hermann Fischer. He stepped off a transport in Bremen, wearing the same American-issued jacket he had been given at Camp Hearne. His boots were clean, his eyes weary but alive. Around him, the air smelled of smoke and damp earth. Germany, his home, felt foreign. He walked through streets where no law, no flag, no future seemed to exist. The swastikas were gone, scraped from the walls, but the silence they left behind was heavier than the rubble. Women bartered bread for cigarettes. Old men stared from doorways. On the ruins of a government building, someone had scrawled a phrase in chalk: "Nie wieder." Never again. Weeks later, Fisher found work helping the Allied administration translate documents for denazification hearings. It was strange, he thought, to serve justice against the regime that had once commanded him. Stranger still to realize that what he had learned in a prison camp in Texas was now the only compass he had left. He began writing again, this time not letters, but essays. The first was titled "Freedom Inside the Fence." In it, he described how, in captivity, he had discovered the idea of democracy not as a theory, but as a way of living. The Americans taught us something no classroom ever could, that power restrained by conscience is stronger than power enforced by fear. They fought us fiercely, then treated us humanely, and in doing so they broke the chain inside us that Hitler had forged. Across Germany, others like him began to emerge, former POWs who had passed through American camps in Texas, Georgia, and Louisiana. They spoke of the same revelation, the same quiet education. Some became teachers, journalists, even future officials in what would become the new Federal Republic of Germany. Historians would later call it re-education, but to the men who lived it, it was something simpler and more profound, an awakening born not of books, but of decency. Back in Hearne, Texas, the old camp was dismantled. The barracks were sold for lumber. The watchtowers came down. Only the concrete foundations remained, swallowed by weeds and time. Yet on some nights, locals swore they could still hear faint voices on the wind, singing Stille Nacht in German, blending softly with the hum of the Texas plains. Those men had come to America as soldiers of a broken cause. They left as the first citizens of a new Germany, one built not on conquest, but on conscience. And though the world forgot Camp Hearne, its quiet experiment in humanity outlived the war that created it. Because sometimes, the truest victory is not won on battlefields, but behind barbed wire, in the hearts of those who finally learn what freedom means.